She had previously characterized him with the derogatory label of a hillbilly, to which he had responded with a polite affirmation, saying, "Yes, madam, I am indeed that, and I possess a far greater understanding of your own district than you currently do." It was the specific variety of morning in Washington that appeared to be artificially constructed, featuring a cloudless sky and the crisp, invigorating air typical of October. The marble facade of the Rayburn House office building captured the sunlight at specific angles, rendering the entire structure akin to a painting of itself. It was the sort of morning that seems to exist specifically so that cable news cameras can film members of Congress ascending the steps, while news anchors describe impending events in voices suggesting something momentous is about to occur, which, in Washington, is usually a generous interpretation of reality. The hearing room, room 2128 on the second floor, the expansive one featuring an elevated dais and a long witness table, along with a gallery capable of seating 300 individuals, was filled to capacity by 8:45 a.m., which was fully 15 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to commence. This level of attendance was highly unusual, as House Financial Services Committee hearings regarding economic mobility do not, as a general rule, generate the type of public interest that fills galleries. Typically, they generate the kind of interest that fills C-SPAN's least-watched time slots, and the sort of attendance that causes committee chairs to wonder if anyone is actually paying attention. Today was entirely different, because the witness was different. The Vice President of the United States does not often testify before congressional committees. It is not prohibited, as the Constitution does not forbid it, but it is rare enough that the last time it happened with any significance, political historians had to reach back decades to find a comparison. Is a D. Vance had agreed to appear voluntarily, a decision that his own staff had advised against, and that the White House counsel's office had described in a memo, which would later leak as legally unnecessary and strategically questionable. Vance attended anyway because the topic was economic mobility. And economic mobility was the subject he had written a book about. And that book had become a movie. And that movie had become a cultural moment. And that cultural moment had evolved into a political career that ended, or began, depending on your perspective, in the second highest office in the country. He understood poverty the way surgeons understand anatomy, which is to say, from the inside. He arrived at 9:01 a.m., exactly 1 minute late, which in Washington is interpreted as either a power move or a traffic problem. In Vance's case, it was merely traffic. He walked into the hearing room alone, with no entourage, no press secretary flanking him, and no aides carrying briefing binders. He was dressed in a dark navy suit that fit him the way suits fit men who did not grow up wearing them. Competently, but without intimacy, like a language learned in adulthood. His tie was a solid blue, and his shoes were polished but not new. He looked, in short, like a man who had been poor long enough that wealth never fully took hold, the way an accent never fully leaves. He sat down at the witness table, adjusted the microphone, poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher, and looked up at the dais where the committee members sat in their elevated row, arranged by seniority, each one framed by a nameplate and a small American flag. At the center of the Democratic side sat Congresswoman Maxine Waters. She was 87 years old and had served in the United States House of Representatives for 35 years, a duration longer than many of her constituents had been alive. She had survived 4 presidents, 6 speakers of the House, and an ethics investigation that had lasted 3 years and generated more pages of documents than most doctoral dissertations. She was the former chair and current ranking member of the House Financial Services Committee, and she was the inventor and owner of the phrase, "reclaiming my time," which had become a viral sensation, a T-shirt slogan, and a rallying cry for an entire wing of the Democratic Party. She was, by any measure, a force. She looked at Vance the way a woman who has been in Congress for 35 years looks at a man who has been in politics for 3, with the particular mixture of condescension and curiosity that the entrenched reserve for the ascendant. "Mr. Vice President," she began before the chairman had finished his opening remarks, which was a procedural violation that she committed with the confidence of someone who had been committing procedural violations since before the chairman was in law school. "Thank you for joining us. I understand you wrote a book about being poor." Vance's expression did not change as he replied, "Yes, ma'am, and then you became a venture capitalist funded by Silicon Valley billionaires like Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, and Eric Schmidt. You raised $93 million for your investment firm. Is that correct?" "That is correct," he affirmed. "And now you are Vice President of the United States," she stated, leaning back in her chair. "Forgive me if I am skeptical about your commitment to the working class, Mr. Vice President, because from where I am sitting, it looks like you wrote a book about poor people, sold it to rich people, and used the money to become one of them." The Democratic members of the committee applauded. Not all of them, 2 or 3, maintained the neutral expressions that committee decorum requires, but enough to create the impression of consensus. The gallery joined in, with the left side producing the kind of enthusiastic clapping that sounds less like agreement and more like a team cheer. Vance waited. He did not lean forward, nor did he bristle. He sat with the particular stillness of a man who had spent 4 years in the United States Marine Corps, learning that the first person to react emotionally in a confrontation is the first person to lose. "Thank you, Congresswoman," he said when the applause faded. "You are right. I did write a book about being poor because I was poor, and I wanted people to understand what that is like." He paused. Not for drama, as Vance was not a dramatic man by nature, but for precision. "I imagine you remember what that is like, too." The sentence landed softly, almost too softly, the way certain sentences do when they contain more than their words suggest. Waters's eyes narrowed a fraction. She recognized something in the sentence, an implication, a direction, a door being opened that she had not expected. "I have been fighting for poor communities for 35 years, Mr. Vice President. I do not need a lecture from you." 35 years? Vance repeated quietly, agreeing. "Yes, ma'am. 35 years? That is a long time." He looked at her and said, "We should talk about that." The most dangerous sentence, J.D. Vance would say all day, was also the quietest. It arrived without emphasis, without edge, without the rhetorical weaponry that Washington usually requires for its most significant moments. It sounded like a suggestion, yet it functioned as a detonator. Waters felt it. You could see it in the way her hand moved, reaching for her gavel not to use it, but to hold it, the way a person reaches for a familiar object when the ground begins to shift. Congresswoman Waters directed the committee's attention to the opioid crisis, which she framed as a failure of the current administration's public health policy, delivering it as an accusation rather than a question, which was how Maxine Waters delivered most things. "Mr. Vice President, the opioid epidemic has devastated communities across this country. Fentanyl deaths have reached record levels. What specifically has this administration done to address the crisis that is killing Americans in my district and districts like mine across the nation?" It was a strong opening. Policy-focused, aggressive, but substantive. The kind of question that, in a normal hearing, would produce a normal answer involving statistics, program names, budget figures, and the administrative vocabulary of governance. Vance did not give a normal answer. When I was 12 years old, he said, my mother came home at 3 in the morning. Waters blinked, and the committee shifted. This was not how witnesses respond to policy questions. This was not testimony. This was something else. I could tell because her eyes were wrong. Not dilated, not constricted, just absent, like she was looking at me through water, like I was there, but she could not quite reach me, and she had stopped trying. The hearing room went quiet, with the particular silence that descends when someone begins telling the truth in a place designed for performance. 300 people in the gallery adjusted in their seats, and the camera operators, who had been set up for a standard hearing with wide shots of the dais and medium shots of the witness, tightened their frames on Vance's face. She sat down at the kitchen table and ate cereal from the box. Dry. No milk, because we didn't have milk. We didn't have milk because she had spent the grocery money on pills, and the pills had run out, so she had moved to something else. And the something else was why her eyes looked like that. He spoke slowly, each sentence carrying the weight of a paragraph. Each paragraph carrying the weight of a chapter in a book that 3 million people had read, but that still somehow sounded different when spoken aloud in a congressional hearing room by the man who had lived it. She told me she was sorry. She was always sorry. Sorry was the most reliable thing about her. It came every time, right on schedule, like a bill you can't pay. And then she fell asleep on the couch, with the television still on. And I covered her with a blanket, and I went back to bed. And in the morning, I made myself breakfast and went to school. He paused. My teacher asked if I was okay. I said yes, because that is what you say when your mother is an addict, and you don't want anyone to know. You say yes, you say fine, you say everything is good, and you hope nobody looks too closely, because if they look closely, they will see the truth, and the truth is more than a 12-year-old knows how to explain. Vance looked up at the dais at Waters. His expression was not accusatory, nor was it angry. It was the expression of a man who is about to connect two things that have not been connected before, and who knows exactly how the connection will land. Your district, Congresswoman, California's 43rd, has one of the highest rates of fentanyl overdose deaths in the state. The numbers have tripled in the last decade. He let that settle. I know what those numbers mean, not as statistics, not as talking points for a hearing. I know what they mean as mornings. As a kid, standing in a kitchen at 6 a.m., wondering whether his mother is asleep or something worse, as the smell of a house where someone is using that particular chemical sweetness that gets into the carpet and the curtains and doesn't leave even after the person does. Congresswoman, is that familiar to you? Because it should be. It is happening right now in the neighborhoods you represent. Not in the abstract, not in a policy brief. Right now, this morning, while we sit in this room, Waters leaned into her microphone. I am well aware of the crisis in my district, Mr. Vice President. I have fought for funding for treatment programs, for community health centers, for 35 years. Vance interrupted gently. The repetition was gentle, almost respectful, and devastating, precisely because of it. You have fought for 35 years, and the fentanyl deaths have tripled. He spread his hands. I am not questioning your effort, Congresswoman. I am questioning your results. He moved to the next story, the way a writer moves to the next chapter, with a transition that felt inevitable rather than forced. There were days I didn't eat dinner, not because we couldn't afford food. Sometimes we could. Sometimes my mama gave us money, or a neighbor brought something over, or the church had a food drive. But there were days my mother forgot. She forgot to buy groceries. She forgot to cook. She forgot I existed because the drugs had taken over the part of her brain that remembered she had a son. His voice carried no self-pity, which was important. Self-pity would have weakened the story, turned it into a plea. What Vance was doing was not pleading. He was reporting, the way a war correspondent reports from a zone of conflict. Factually, precisely, with the controlled detachment of someone who has seen enough to know that the facts are sufficient. I ate cereal from boxes. I ate peanut butter from jars with my fingers. I ate whatever was in the cabinet that didn't require cooking, because I was 12, and cooking meant the stove, and the stove meant fire, and fire meant something else to worry about in a house that already had too many things to worry about. He looked at Waters. Food insecurity in your district is 23%, Congresswoman. That means roughly 1 in 4 of your constituents doesn't know where their next meal is coming from. 1 in 4. In the richest state, in the richest country, in the history of the world. He let the number breathe. Has that number improved in 35 years? Waters did not answer because the number had not improved. Because food insecurity in south-central Los Angeles in the year Maxine Waters took office and food insecurity in south-central Los Angeles today were, depending on which data set you consulted, either identical or worse. And Waters knew this because she was many things combative, theatrical, occasionally reckless. But she was not unintelligent, and unintelligent people do not survive 35 years in Congress. She knew the number, and she knew that Vance knew she knew. But hunger and addiction are enormous problems, Vance said, his voice shifting again, descending into something quieter and more dangerous. Maybe too big for one hearing, maybe too big for one congresswoman. So let's talk about something smaller. Let's talk about something concrete. He folded his hands. Let's talk about where you live. The question arrived the way a thrown stone arrives at a window, with a brief whistling silence before the impact. Congresswoman, where do you live? Waters's expression tightened. In 35 years of congressional service, she had been asked thousands of questions about policy, about legislation, about her political positions, about her family, about her ethics, investigations. She had answered most of them with the combative eloquence that had made her famous and the procedural savvy that had kept her in office. But this question, 3 words, 5 syllables, landed differently. It landed personally. I live in Los Angeles, she said, in a home I have owned for decades, where I have raised my family and served my community. In Hancock Park, Vance said. Windsor Square area. Is that correct? I don't see how my address is relevant to this hearing. It is relevant because this hearing is about economic mobility, and your address tells a story about economic mobility that I think the American people deserve to hear. He spoke without notes. Vance had no papers in front of him, no briefing binder, no folder of opposition research. Everything he said came from a place that was either memory or preparation so thorough that it had become indistinguishable from memory. Your home is valued at approximately $4.8 million. It sits on a tree-lined street in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Los Angeles. 6 bedrooms, manicured grounds, the kind of property that real estate agents describe with words like elegant and stately, and a rare opportunity. He paused. It is a beautiful home, Congresswoman. I mean that sincerely. If I had grown up driving past a house like that, I would have stared at it from the car window and wondered what kind of people lived inside. The compliment was a setup, and everyone in the room knew it. But knowing a punch is coming does not prevent it from landing. But here is what interests me about your home. Your congressional district, California's 43rd, covers south-central Los Angeles, Watts, Willowbrook, parts of Compton, Florence, Firestone. These are the communities you represent. The people who vote for you, who trust you, who send you to Washington every 2 years to fight for them. He leaned forward. And your house isn't in your district. The gallery murmured, not loudly, but the murmur of a crowd that has just heard something it suspected but didn't know for certain. The sound of confirmation. You live outside the boundaries of the community you represent, Congresswoman. Your $5 million house is in a different neighborhood, a different world, a different zip code than the people who elected you. Waters's voice cut through. There is no constitutional residency requirement for congressional districts, and I have maintained a strong presence in my community for 35 years. Yes, you have mentioned that? Vance nodded. And you are right. There is no legal requirement that you live in your district. No law that says you have to sleep in the same neighborhoods as the people who vote for you. No regulation that requires you to walk the same streets, shop at the same stores, send your children to the same schools. His voice dropped. But there is a moral one. The room held its breath. Not because the statement was surprising, it was in fact predictable, but because of the way Vance said it. He said it the way his grandmother would have said it, flatly, without decoration, with the absolute certainty of someone who learned right from wrong, not in a seminar or a textbook, but at a kitchen table in Middletown, Ohio, from a woman who owned 19 handguns and had a 7th-grade education and never in her life said anything she didn't mean. I know what it is like to live in poverty, Congresswoman. Not visit it, not drive through it with the windows up, not hold a town hall in it, and then drive home to a different neighborhood. I know what it is like to live in it, sleep in it, eat in it, go to school in it, you walk home from school, in it past the houses, with the couches on the porch, and the yards that nobody mows anymore because nobody has the energy or the hope. I lived in a house where the locks didn't work, and the heat cut out in January, and my mother's boyfriend of the month slept on our couch, and I lay awake at night listening to them argue about money they didn't have. He looked at the dais with an expression that contained no anger, only clarity. How does a public servant on a salary of $174,000 per year come to live in a house worth nearly $5 million? Waters opened her mouth. Your husband, Vance said before she could answer, is Sidney Williams, former United States ambassador to the Bahamas, former board member of One United Bank. He paused. We will get to that. The promise we will get to that sent a ripple through the committee, the way a tremor moves through a building before the earthquake properly arrives. It was not a threat. It was an itinerary. Vance was telling the room where this was going, and where it was going was somewhere Maxine Waters had spent 35 years, making sure no one went. Median household income in your district, Vance continued, is approximately $40,000. Poverty rate, 25%. Homelessness in Los Angeles County, more than 75,000 people living on the streets on any given night. Many of them in or near the neighborhoods you represent. He spoke these numbers the way a doctor speaks a diagnosis. Not cruelly, not with pleasure, but with the grim precision of someone who understands that accuracy matters more than comfort. Your constituents live in apartments smaller than your garage. Some of them live in tents. Some of them sleep in cars. Some of them sleep on sidewalks, 3 miles from your front door, close enough to walk if they had the energy. If the walk didn't take them past the kind of houses where people like them aren't welcome. And you have represented them for 35 years. The refrain appeared again, each time heavier, each time the number sounding less like a credential and more like an indictment. In Middletown, Ohio, my hometown, the Armco steel mill closed. The jobs left. The drugs came. The families fell apart. I watched it happen. I was a child watching his world collapse. One layoff at a time, one overdose at a time, one eviction at a time. The difference between Middletown and your district, Congresswoman, is this. Middletown didn't have a champion in Congress for 35 years promising to fix things. Your district did. He let that sit, and the poverty rate is the same. Vance shifted in his chair, not restlessly, but deliberately. The way a man shifts when he is moving from one subject to another and wants the room to understand that the new subject is heavier than the last. "I want to talk about families," he said, "about what public service does to them, about the difference between families that are broken by poverty and families that are built by it." He started with his own. "In my family, public service meant my mother working as a nurse when she could work, when the drugs let her, when the latest boyfriend hadn't stolen her car, or her paycheck, or her will to get out of bed. Public service meant my grandmother raising me on a fixed income because her daughter couldn't. It meant my father disappearing before I was old enough to understand what disappearing meant. In my family, public service was sacrifice. You gave more than you got. You worked harder than was fair. And at the end of it, you still didn't have much. But what you had was honest." He looked at the dais. "In your family, Congresswoman, public service seems to work differently." The hearing room stiffened, not with shock. Washington is not easily shocked, but with the specific tension that precedes revelation. The reporters in the press section stopped typing and started listening, which is the journalist's equivalent of a dog's ears going up. "Your daughter," Vance said, "Karen Waters, has received more than $1.2 million from your campaign committee, Citizens for Waters. Since 2003, he let the number hang, 1,2 million. In a room full of politicians accustomed to billions and trillions, 1.2 million should have sounded small. It did not sound small. It sounded enormous, because Vance had spent the last 20 minutes establishing the context. The poverty, the hunger, the tense cities against which one. $2 million paid to a congresswoman's daughter for mailing endorsement flyers was not a campaign expense, but an obscenity. The payments are listed as slate mailer management fees. For those watching at home who may not be familiar with the term, a slate mailer is an endorsement flyer, a pamphlet sent to voters listing the candidates that a politician supports. Other candidates pay your campaign to appear on the mailer. Your daughter manages the operation. Your daughter gets paid." He continued with the measured pace of a man who has done his research and does not need to rush because the facts are not going anywhere. "You are the only federal politician in the United States who runs a slate mailer operation from a federal campaign committee. The only one. Not one of a few. Not part of a common practice. The only one. In April of this year, just a few months ago, the Federal Election Commission fined your campaign $68,000 for violating campaign finance laws related to this operation." Waters leaned forward. Her voice carried the sharp edge of a woman who has been attacked before and survived, who has weathered investigations and accusations and the particular cruelty of political opposition, and emerged each time with her seat intact and her voice undiminished. "Those payments are for legal services that have been reviewed and approved by the FEC. My daughter performs legitimate campaign work, and I will not sit here." "I am not saying they are illegal, Congresswoman," Vance said, his voice calm. The calm of someone who has been trained to remain calm under fire. Literally in Iraq, where calm was the difference between living and dying. And metaphorically, in every media appearance, every debate, every hearing since. "I am saying that while your constituents struggle to afford groceries, while 1 in 4 of them doesn't know where their next meal is coming from, your daughter has received $1.2 million for mailing endorsement flyers. I am saying that the contrast between your family's finances and your constituents' finances is the kind of contrast that makes people lose faith in government." He moved to the next data point. Not quickly. Vance was not a quick man in the way Shapiro was quick or Patel was quick. He was thorough, which is a different kind of speed, the kind that gets there eventually but brings everything with it. And it is not just your daughter. Your grandson, Mikhail Moore, served as your chief of staff. Your grandson, your daughter's son, working in your office, paid by taxpayers. The House Ethics Committee investigated his conduct regarding One United Bank and found that he had taken actions, and I am quoting the committee's own language, unambiguously intended to assist One United specifically. He received an official reprimand, which brings us, Vance said, to One United. He told the story the way a prosecutor tells a story, chronologically, factually, with enough detail to be damning and enough restraint to appear fair. In 2008, the financial crisis was collapsing banks across the country. One United Bank, a minority-owned bank in Boston, where your husband, Sidney Williams, sat on the board of directors and owned stock valued at more than $350,000, was in trouble. Its capital was, in the words of federal regulators, all but wiped out. You arranged a meeting between the Treasury Secretary's office and representatives of the National Bankers Association, which represents minority-owned banks. But at that meeting, 3 of the 4 attendees had ties to One United. One United asked for $50 million in federal assistance. It ultimately received $12 million through the Troubled Asset Relief Program. $12 million in taxpayer money to a bank where your husband was a board member and stockholder. After a meeting that you arranged, he held up his hand, anticipating the objection. The House Ethics Committee charged you with 3 counts of violating House rules in 2010. The investigation lasted 3 years. In 2012, the committee concluded that you had not personally violated the rules, that you had disclosed your financial ties and recused yourself from direct involvement. But your grandson hadn't recused himself. Your grandson, your chief of staff, had continued to advocate for One United after you stepped back, and he was reprimanded for it. Vance paused. The pause was not for effect. It was for the weight of what came next. Your family, Congresswoman, your husband, your daughter, your grandson, have all financially benefited from your position in Congress. Your husband's bank got $12 million in bailout money. Your daughter has received $2 million in campaign funds. Your grandson was your chief of staff. Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, not a conservative organization, not a Republican group, a nonpartisan ethics watchdog, named you to their most corrupt members of Congress's list 4 times. In 2005, 2006, 2009, and 2011. He looked at her with an expression that was not hostile, but was no longer sympathetic either. It was the expression of a man who had grown up watching families fall apart from poverty and was now watching a family get rich from public service, and found the contrast unbearable. My mother couldn't afford rehab. Your husband's bank got $12 million. He let that sentence sit in the room like a physical object. We live in very different Americas, Congresswoman. And then it came. The phrase that the gallery had been waiting for, that the cameras had been anticipating, that the internet would replay 100 million times before the week was over. Reclaiming my time, Waters said, her hand striking the dais. Reclaiming my time. The words echoed through the hearing room with the force of a 35-year habit. The verbal equivalent of a fist on a table, the catchphrase that had launched 1,000 t-shirts and 1 million social media posts. But this time, in this room, after everything that had been said, the words didn't land the way they usually did. They didn't sound powerful. They sounded desperate, like a woman reaching for her weapon and finding that it had been emptied while she wasn't looking. Vance sat perfectly still. He did not flinch. He did not lean back. He waited with the patience of a Marine who has spent nights in a foxhole in Iraq waiting for dawn, which is the most patient kind of waiting there is. "I'll wait, ma'am," he said quietly. "I have nowhere else to be." The chairman asked Congresswoman Waters to allow the witness to complete his response. Waters sat back in her chair, her jaws set, her eyes carrying the particular fury of a woman who has been challenged in her own hearing room by a man she considers beneath her station. Vance poured himself another glass of water. He drank it slowly. Then he set the glass down and said calmly, as if nothing had happened, "We were talking about families. There is a moment in every confrontation, in every debate, every trial, every argument between two people who believe themselves to be right, when the balance shifts. It does not announce itself. There is no bell, no signal, no narrator stepping forward to say, 'Here is where it changed.' It simply happens. A sentence, a silence, a look, and afterward, both people know. The room knows. The air knows. The moment came when Vance said, 'You just said, we're claiming my time.' He said it gently, observationally, the way you might note that it was raining outside. Not a complaint, not an accusation, just a fact about the weather. It is your signature phrase. Congresswoman, I have seen the clips. Everyone has. They go viral every time. You say it, and the internet lights up. T-shirts get printed. Hashtags trend. Cable news plays it on a loop." He nodded, as if acknowledging something genuinely impressive. "It is a great phrase. 2 words. Clear, direct, impossible to misunderstand. You own it the way certain athletes own a move. It is yours, and everyone knows it." The Democrats on the committee relaxed slightly. This sounded like a concession, like Vance was backing off, retreating to compliment, preparing to pivot to safer ground. He was not, but I would like to ask, whose time are you reclaiming? The question arrived without fanfare, without emphasis, with the simplicity of a child asking why the sky is blue, which is the kind of question that adults find difficult to answer precisely because it is so simple. Because it seems to me, Congresswoman, that the people of the 43rd District have been giving you their time for 35 years. They show up every 2 years and vote for you. They give you their trust. They give you their hope. They give you the most valuable thing a citizen can give, an elected official. Time. Their time. Not yours. Theirs. He leaned forward. And what have they gotten for it? He began to list. Not with the rapid-fire cadence of a debater scoring points, but slowly. The way you list things at a funeral, one by one, with space between each item. For the wait to register, poverty rate essentially unchanged in 35 years. Housing affordability, worse. Gang violence persistent. Drug overdoses tripled in the last decade. Homelessness crisis level, the worst in the nation. Public school performance below state average. Each item landed with the dull, heavy sound of a fact that cannot be argued with. Not because the data was indisputable. All data is disputable. But because Vance delivered it with the authority of a man who had lived on the other side of those statistics, who had been the poverty rate, the food insecurity number, the child of the overdose epidemic, and who therefore could not be dismissed as a man reading numbers from a briefing sheet. 35 years, he said. That is a generation and a half. A baby born the year you took office is now 35 years old. If they grew up in your district, statistically they had a 1 in 4 chance of growing up in poverty. And their child, the next generation, the generation being born right now in the hospitals you drive past on your way home to Hancock Park, has the same odds. He spread his hands, palms up, empty, the gesture of a man who has looked for something and found nothing. Nothing changed. In 35 years, nothing changed. His voice had undergone a transformation that the hearing room felt before it understood. The warmth was gone. The empathy, the storyteller's empathy, The memoirist's tenderness for the details of his own suffering had been replaced by something colder, not cruel. Cold the way a scalpel is cold. Functional, precise, designed for a specific purpose. You reclaim your time, Congresswoman. You reclaim it every hearing, every press conference, every time a witness says something you would rather not address. You reclaim your time. He paused. But you can't reclaim those 35 years for the people who trusted you with them. Waters responded with the practiced fluency of a woman who has been defending her record since before J.D. Vance could read. She cited legislation, bills introduced, hearings chaired, committee actions, floor speeches. She cited her role in the Dodd-Frank Act. She cited her advocacy for affordable housing, for minority-owned businesses, for community development. She spoke with force and specificity, and the Democratic members of the committee nodded along with the synchronized rhythm of people who have heard the same speech before and believe in it. Vance listened. He listened the way he had been taught to listen in the Marines, completely, without interruption. Cataloging each claim, the way a soldier catalogs terrain features before crossing open ground. When she finished, he asked one question: how many of those bills became law? Waters stared at him. How many of those committee hearings resulted in measurable improvement in your district? Not in Washington, not in the Federal Register. In your district? In Watts? In Willowbrook? In the neighborhoods where your constituents actually live? The silence was 4 seconds long. In congressional hearing terms, 4 seconds is geological time. 4 seconds is long enough for a camera to capture the exact moment a person realizes they don't have an answer, and long enough for 300 people in a gallery to reach the same conclusion simultaneously. I grew up in a town with no champion, Vance said quietly. Nobody in Congress fighting for Middletown, Ohio. No ranking member, no committee chair, no viral catchphrase. Just a steel town dying in slow motion with nobody watching. And the poverty rate in Middletown and the poverty rate in your district are almost identical. He let the comparison complete itself, which means either Middletown didn't need a champion or your district never had one. What happened next was not politics. It was not testimony. It was not the kind of thing that belongs in a hearing room, because hearing rooms are designed for procedure and precedent and the careful maintenance of institutional decorum. And what J.D. Vance did next had nothing to do with any of those things. He talked about his grandmother. The shift was physical before it was verbal. His shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in release. The way a man's shoulders drop when he stops performing and starts remembering. His hands, which had been folded on the table in the disciplined posture of a former Marine, unclenched. His jaw, which had been set with the controlled tension of a man choosing every word with surgical care, softened. I want to tell you about my mama, he said. The word mama hung in the air of the Rayburn building like a word from a different language, which, in a sense, it was. It was Appalachian. It was Kentucky. It was the language of coal country and holler towns and families that have been in the same hills for generations. And it sounded in that marble room in Washington like a stone from another planet. Her name was Bonnie Vance. She was born in Jackson, Kentucky, in Breathitt County, which people used to call Bloody Breathitt because of the feuds. She had a 7th-grade education. She married my papa when she was 13, which was young even for Kentucky, and they moved to Middletown so papa could work at the Armco steel mill, where he worked until the work ran out. He spoke with the rhythm of a man reading from a book he had written, which he was. The words existed in Hillbilly Elegy, in chapters that millions of people had read, but spoken aloud in this context, with this audience, they carried a different weight. They were no longer literature. They were evidence. They fought. Lord, they fought. Mama once threw a vase at Papa's head and missed by an inch, which, knowing Mama, meant she intended to miss by an inch. She owned 19 handguns. 19, she kept them in various locations around the house. In drawers, in closets, under beds, the way other grandmothers keep doilies. She drank too much. She smoked too much. She cussed in combinations that I am fairly certain violated federal obscenity standards. Laughter. Warm, unexpected, irresistible laughter. The kind that crosses political lines because it comes from recognition rather than agreement. Even 2 of the Democratic committee members smiled quickly before remembering where they were. And she saved my life. The laughter stopped completely, instantly. The way laughter stops when it runs into something real. When my mother couldn't take care of me, when the drugs were winning and the boyfriends were rotating and the house was chaos, Mama took me in. Not legally, not through the foster system, not through any official channel that the government provides for children whose parents can't function. She just took me, put me in her spare bedroom, fed me, made sure I went to school, checked my homework at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a cigarette, and an expression that said very clearly that wrong answers would not be tolerated. His voice did something it had not done all day. It cracked. Not dramatically, not the Hollywood crack, the single tear rolling down the cheek crack, a real crack. Small. The hairline fracture in a man's voice when he is talking about someone he loved, who is gone, and who he wishes were not gone. She sat me down one night. I was maybe 14, and she said, "Jay, you're smart. Don't let anyone tell you different. Not your mother, not those teachers, not anyone. You're smart, and you're going to get out of here. And when you do, don't you dare forget where you came from." He paused, looked down at his hands. She didn't have a college degree. She didn't have a government program. She didn't have a committee hearing or a policy paper or a viral catchphrase. She had a kitchen table, a pot of coffee, and the stubborn, unreasonable, beautiful belief that her grandson was going to be okay. The hearing room was church silent, the silence of 300 people who have simultaneously stopped breathing, stopped shifting, stopped thinking about anything except the man in front of them and the woman he was describing. She died before I graduated from Yale. She never saw me become a senator. She never saw me become vice president. She would have hated Washington. Too many people talking, not enough people doing. She would have looked at this hearing room and said something profane about the chairs. A single laugh, brief, involuntary, from somewhere in the gallery. But she would have understood this conversation because Mama understood poverty not as a policy issue, not as a committee agenda item, but as a life. She understood that poverty isn't about money, or it is about money, but it's about more than money. It's about hopelessness. It's about watching your daughter destroy herself and not being able to stop it. It's about growing up in a house where violence is the weather. It comes and goes, unpredictable. And you just learn to live with it. He looked up at Waters. The crack in his voice was gone. What replaced it was something harder. Not angry, not cold, but set. The way concrete sets. The way a decision sets. My mama understood something that 35 years of committee hearings have apparently not taught anyone in this building. You don't fix poverty from a mansion in Hancock Park, Congresswoman. You don't fix it from a hearing room in the Rayburn building. You fix it by being in it, by knowing the people, by sitting at their kitchen tables. When was the last time you sat at a kitchen table in Watts, Congresswoman? Not a town hall, not a campaign event, not a ribbon-cutting ceremony with cameras and staff, and a motorcade idling outside. A kitchen table, just you and a mother who doesn't know how she's going to feed her children tomorrow. The question hung in the air. because I have sat at those tables. In Middletown, in Appalachia, in towns across Ohio and Kentucky and West Virginia that look exactly like your district. Same poverty, same drugs, same broken families, same shattered dreams. And the people at those tables aren't asking for more committee hearings. They aren't asking for viral catchphrases or endorsement mailers. They are asking why. Why? After 35 years, their congresswoman lives in a mansion and their streets look exactly the same. Maxine Waters stood up. The movement was sudden, physical, and charged with the particular energy of a woman who has been sitting still for too long, absorbing blows she did not expect, enduring testimony she had not prepared for, in a hearing she had designed to be an attack, and that had become, by degrees, an ambush. She stood because sitting was no longer tolerable, because the hearing room had shifted under her the way the ground shifts in an earthquake, slowly at first, then all at once, and the position she had held for 35 years, the moral high ground of a woman who fought for the poor, was no longer hers. A man from a town she had never visited had taken it from her, and he had done it not with documents or subpoenas or the institutional weaponry of Washington, but with stories about dry cereal and kitchen tables and a grandmother with 19 guns. Reclaiming my time, the words came out differently this time, not as a procedural move, not as a power play, as something closer to a battle cry, the sound of a woman fighting for territory she is losing. You sit there, Mr. Vice President. You sit there with your Yale degree and your venture capital millions and your best-selling book and your Netflix movie, and you lecture me about poverty. Her voice carried the heat of genuine anger, not the manufactured outrage of cable news appearances, but the real thing. Forged in 87 years of life, 35 years of service, and a childhood that was in its own way as hard as his. I was born in a house with 13 children. My father left when I was 2 years old. My mother raised us alone. I worked in a garment factory. I was a telephone operator. I was an assistant teacher in Head Start, making barely enough to live on long before you were born. She pointed at him, her finger steady, her voice gaining strength. I have fought for black communities, for poor communities, for communities that people like you write books about and then leave. That is what you did. Mr. Vance, you left Middletown. You went to the Marines and you left. You went to Ohio State and you left. You went to Yale and you left. You went to Silicon Valley and you left. You came to Washington and you left your district behind. She leaned into the microphone. You didn't stay and fight. You didn't spend 35 years in the trenches trying to get funding for schools and housing and health care, while people in comfortable offices criticized you from a distance. You wrote about it. You put it in a book. You sold it to Netflix. And now you sit there and tell me I don't understand poverty. The gallery erupted. The Democratic side of the room produced the kind of sustained, full-throated applause that sounds less like approval and more like relief. The sound of partisans who have been watching their champion take hits for an hour and are desperate for a counterpunch. Even some of the Republican staffers in the back of the room shifted uncomfortably because the speech was good. It was genuine. It was the best Maxine Waters had been all day, and the best Maxine Waters is formidable. Vance did not move. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his face composed, his body still, and he waited for the applause to exhaust itself, the way a man who has weathered sandstorms in Al-Anbar province waits for weather, patiently, without complaint, knowing that all storms end. The room quieted slowly, the way rooms quiet when they realize the other person hasn't spoken yet and might be about to. You are right, Vance said. 2 words. The quietest 2 words of the day. I left. He nodded. Not to concede defeat, but to concede a fact. which is a different thing. I left Middletown. I joined the Marines and I left. I went to Ohio State and I left. I went to Yale and I left. I went to San Francisco and I left. You are right about all of that. He paused. But I came back. The sentence changed the temperature in the room by several degrees. That is what hillbilly elegy is, Congresswoman. It is me going back. Not physically. I didn't move back to Middletown, and you are right to point that out. But going back in the way that matters most. Going back to the people, to the stories, to the truth of what happened to communities like mine. Going back to tell it honestly, even when honesty meant writing about my own mother's addiction, my own family's violence, my own shame. I went back to tell their story because nobody else was telling it. Because the people in Middletown and Appalachia and the Rust Belt had been invisible for decades. Invisible to the media, invisible to politicians, invisible to the country, and someone needed to make them visible. He looked at Waters. You left too, Congresswoman. The room tensed. You left South Central. You moved to Hancock Park. $5 million house, tree-lined streets. A different zip code from the people who gave you their votes and their time and their trust for 35 years. His voice dropped to a register that the hearing room had not heard before. Not cold, not angry, not empathetic. Something else. Something that had no name because it existed in the space between accusation and sorrow, between judgment and grief. But here is the difference between us. He leaned forward 1 inch, just enough for the camera to register the movement, just enough for every person watching in the gallery, on C-SPAN, on their phones in their living rooms to lean forward too. I left and came back to tell the truth. Pause. You left and came back to collect the check. The room made no sound, no applause, no murmur, no intake of breath. The silence was total. The kind of silence that exists in spaces where something irreversible has just occurred. The silence after a door closes. The silence after a verdict. The silence that follows the last note of a song that has moved every person in the room for reasons they can't fully explain. The chairman's gavel came down twice. This hearing is concluded. Waters' voice cut through. This is outrageous. This is a political smear orchestrated by. Vance was already standing. Not quickly, slowly. The way a man stands when he has said what he came to say, and has no interest in saying more. Congresswoman, he said, buttoning his jacket with the absent precision of a man performing a gesture he performs 100 times a day. If anything I have said today is factually wrong, I encourage you to correct the record. If the poverty rate has improved, show me. If the homelessness numbers have gone down, show me. If your daughter didn't receive $1.2 million from your campaign, show me. If the FEC didn't fine your campaign $68,000, show me. He picked up his glass of water, drank the last of it, and set it down. Every number I cited today is public record. FEC filings, census data, property records, ethics committee reports, not opinions, not interpretations, records. He stepped away from the witness table. I grew up in a town where people got left behind, Congresswoman. I wrote a book about it. It is my whole thing. He turned toward the door. I am not going anywhere. He walked out of the hearing room alone, the way he had walked in. No entourage, no press secretary, no aides. Just a man in a suit that didn't quite fit him the way Washington suits are supposed to, walking through the marble hallway of the Rayburn building. Past the portraits of former committee chairmen, past the security officers, past the reporters who shouted questions he didn't answer, and out into the October sunlight where a black SUV was waiting to take him back to a residence that still, after months, didn't feel like home. Behind him in room 2128, Maxine Waters sat at the dais, surrounded by staffers and Democratic colleagues who offered the kind of words people offer when they don't know what else to say. Her gavel sat untouched in front of her. Her phone buzzed with notifications she didn't check. Her communications director was already drafting a statement that would describe the hearing as a partisan attack and a disrespectful display, which was accurate in the way that describing a hurricane as weather is accurate, technically correct, but fundamentally inadequate. She sat there for a long time after the room emptied, longer than anyone expected, longer than the cameras stayed. She sat there because she was 87 years old, and she had been in Congress for 35 years, and a man 47 years younger than her had just done something that no one had done before. Not the ethics investigators, not the reporters, not the opposition candidates who had challenged her in elections she won by margins that made the challenges seem foolish. He had made her record sound like a failure, and the worst part, the part that would keep her awake that night in a house worth nearly $5 million, 3 miles from a district where 1 in 4 children goes to bed hungry, was that he had done it with facts she couldn't dispute and stories she couldn't match. Because his stories were real, and hers were 35 years old. The clip hit 40 million views before sunset. Not the full hearing. Nobody watches full hearings the same way nobody reads entire congressional reports or listens to complete floor speeches. The clip, the 23-second sequence that began with, "I left and came back to tell the truth," and ended with, "You left and came back to collect the check." 23 seconds. 11 words on each side of the comma. Perfectly balanced. Perfectly devastating. The kind of sentence that sounds like it was written by a speechwriter and workshopped by a focus group, but was in fact spoken extemporaneously by a man who grew up eating dry cereal at 3 in the morning. By evening, it was the top trending clip on every platform. By the next morning, it had been translated into 9 languages. By the end of the week, it had generated more opinion pieces, fact checks, and cable news segments than any congressional hearing since the Watergate era, which was an exaggeration that several columnists made anyway, because exaggeration is the native language of political commentary. The fact-checkers went to work with the grim enthusiasm of people who expected to find errors and were disappointed. The poverty rate in Waters' district, confirmed by census data, essentially flat over 3 decades. The $4.8 million mansion, confirmed by property records and real estate databases. The $1.2 million to Karen Waters, confirmed by Federal Election Commission filings, publicly available, searchable by anyone with an internet connection. The $68,000 FEC fine, confirmed, unanimous 4-0 decision, April of the current year. The One United Bank details, confirmed by the House Ethics Committee's own report, 200 pages publicly available on congress.gov. Every number Vance had cited was public record. Every fact he had stated was documented. The fact-checkers, unable to find substantive errors, resorted to characterizing his presentation as misleading by omission and lacking nuance, which is what fact-checkers say when the facts are correct, but the conclusion is inconvenient. Waters' office released a statement that evening. It described the hearing as a racist attack designed to undermine the legacy of one of the most accomplished black women in American political history. It cited her decades of service, her legislative accomplishments, her advocacy for communities of color. It did not address the poverty rate. It did not address the daughter's payments. It did not address the mansion. It did not address the FEC fine. The statement was shared widely. Her supporters rallied. Auntie Maxine trended alongside, "Reclaiming my time." The Democratic establishment offered the measured, careful support that the Democratic establishment offers when a member is under fire, and the facts are not on their side. Statements of solidarity that praised her career without mentioning the specifics, the political equivalent of a hug that avoids the wound. J. D. Vance did not give a victory speech. He did not appear on Fox News or Newsmax or any of the conservative media outlets that would have given him a hero's welcome and a prime-time slot. He gave one interview, not to a national outlet, but to a podcast from Middletown, Ohio, a small show hosted by a former steelworker's son who covered Rust Belt communities and whose audience was measured in thousands rather than millions. "People are saying you were too tough on her," the host said. Vance was quiet for a moment. "I have been tougher on myself," he said. "Read the book. I wrote more honestly about my own family's failures, my mother's addiction, my family's violence, my own anger, than anything I said about Congresswoman Waters today. Being honest about people you disagree with is easy. Being honest about yourself is hard." What do you want people to take away from today? That poverty isn't a slogan, Vance said. It is not a committee hearing. It is not, "We're claiming my time." It is not a catchphrase on a t-shirt. He paused. Poverty is a kid eating dry cereal at 3 in the morning because his mother is passed out on the couch. That is what it is. That is all it is. And if you are going to claim to represent that kid, you should at least live in the same zip code. That evening, the Vice President of the United States did something he had done every evening since he was 14 years old. He called his mother. Beverly Vance, who had been at various points in her life a nurse, an addict, a patient, a burden, a regret, and a cautionary tale in a best-selling book written by her own son, was sober now, had been for years. Their relationship was not simple. It would never be simple. It was layered with decades of damage and repair, of nights that couldn't be taken back, and mornings that had to be gotten through, of the particular complexity that exists between a child who survived and the parent who almost didn't. "You were on TV today," she said. "I was. Was it about the poverty stuff?" He almost smiled. The poverty stuff? His mother had a gift for reducing the biggest things in the world to their smallest possible descriptions. The way people do when the biggest things have happened to them personally, and they no longer need the big words. Something like that. A long pause. The kind of pause that exists between people who have survived each other, between a mother who chose drugs over her son, and a son who wrote about it for the world to read, and who somehow, against all probability, still calls her every night. "You did good, Jay." He didn't say anything because some things don't need a response. Some things just need to be heard. He hung up. He sat in the vice president's residence, a house on the grounds of the Naval Observatory that was, he sometimes thought, the least home-like home he had ever lived in, which was saying something, considering the homes he had lived in. And he thought about dry cereal and kitchen tables, and a woman named Bonnie, who owned 19 handguns, and told him he was smart, and meant it. Outside, Washington did what Washington always does. It moved on. By tomorrow, there would be another hearing, another clip, another controversy. The machine doesn't stop. The machine doesn't care about kitchen tables or cereal boxes or grandmothers in Middletown. The machine cares about news cycles and approval ratings and the next election. Always the next election. The permanent campaign that grinds through human stories the way a mill grinds through grain. Efficiently, relentlessly, without regard for what gets lost in the grinding. But 3,000 miles away, in a one-bedroom apartment on Crenshaw Boulevard, in the heart of California's 43rd Congressional District, a woman named Denise turned off her phone and sat on the edge of her bed. She was 41 years old. She had lived in Maxine Waters' district for 22 years. She worked 2 jobs, morning shift at a hospital laundry facility, evening shift at a gas station on Figueroa. She had a daughter in the 8th grade who needed braces they couldn't afford, and a son in the 5th grade who was smart enough for a better school, but attended the one within walking distance because Denise couldn't afford a 10 car. She had watched the hearing on her phone during her lunch break, earbuds in, eating a sandwich she had made that morning because buying lunch was a luxury she had stopped pretending she could afford. She didn't know J.D. Vance. She had never heard of Mama. She had never read Hillbilly Elegy. She didn't know about Middletown, Ohio, or Armco Steel, or the specific way that Appalachian poverty and South Central poverty were different in their details and identical in their weight. But she knew dry cereal at 3 in the morning. She knew it intimately. She knew the sound of a house where someone has stopped trying, the look in a child's eyes when they have learned to take care of themselves too early, the particular exhaustion of working 2 jobs and still falling behind. And she knew. She had known for a long time, in the quiet way, that people know things they don't say out loud, that her congresswoman lived in a different world than she did. Not a different neighborhood, a different world. A world of galas and committees and cable news appearances and a $5 million house in a zip code where the garbage gets picked up on time and the streetlights work and nobody worries about their tooth breaking because they can't afford the dentist. Denise had voted for Maxine Waters in every election since she was 19. She would probably vote for her again because habit is stronger than disappointment and because the alternative was usually worse. But tonight, sitting on the edge of a bed in an apartment she could barely afford, in a district where 1 in 4 people didn't know where their next meal was coming from, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not hope, something in between. The feeling that someone, somewhere, in a hearing room she would never enter, in a city she would never visit, in a world as distant from hers as the moon, had seen her, had described her life without knowing her name, had understood the weight of it. Someone in Washington knew what dry cereal at 3 in the morning meant. And for Denise, on that particular night, in that particular apartment in the 43rd District of the state of California, that was enough. Not enough to change anything, not enough to pay the bills or fix the braces or buy a car, but enough to make her feel, for the first time in 22 years, like she was not invisible,